Hi, everyone, and welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Viktoria Soltesz, and this is the Soltesz Institute, whereby we are fighting for an ethical and transparent industry. And that's why this subject is really close to my heart, because today we are going to talk about money laundering. We're going to figure out what is money laundering, how can someone get involved in money laundering and then get out and teach us all about why money laundering is even taking place and how to spot all of those creative ways of the criminals whereby they try to zigzag around the system. So today is going to be a very, very exciting topics about money laundering. And today I'm having my guest, Ken Rijok, with me. Well, Ken started as a Vietnam veteran, and he's got an amazing story how he ended up being a criminal and doing money laundering for the biggest gangs who were shoveling drugs all over the streets of America back in the 90s. Ken is one of the very few people who turn good guy from a bad guy, and he's going to tell us all about his journey. He was actually helping different illegal organizations of doing money laundering in a way which is going through international banking system and be able to use for personal purposes when the tax office couldn't even figure out what was the source of funds. It's a very, very fascinating way of looking at money laundering, and I think we can learn so much about it. In the 1980s, Ken was the middleman between the Colombians and the mafia, flooding America's streets with cocaine and marijuana. And of course, from the proceeds, they wanted to make some money laundering to justify how they got so much of a wealth. But it's not just only the criminals who are doing money laundering. We're going to talk about even politicians or the corruption money, or just simply somehow people just don't want to pay their taxes. That is all considered to be money laundering. So basically, money laundering is the process of disguising the origins of the illegally acquired funds in a way to hide what is the source of funds to cover the criminal activity, and introducing this money back to the financial system as legit and use it if it was earned. Nowadays, I think it's much harder to commit money laundering because everybody's asking you, if you try to buy a house or you try to buy a car, what is the origin of that funds? But I think Ken might have a different idea about it, because he thinks that today it's even easier to commit money laundering, because today we are all living in a free world when the whole world can be connected. And even though we are trying to harmonize different laws and regulations internationally, there is still a lot of room for all of those bad guys to try to outsmart the system. So I think today is going to be absolutely fantastic. Definitely stay with us, because we're going to learn a lot from Ken. And just to give you another surprise, Ken is also going to give us a full seminar about how not to do money laundering and how to spot all of those criminal activities if you are in compliance. So this can give us a lot of insights. So I would definitely recommend to join us today and stick with us on this webinar. And Ken is telling us all his secrets.
So thank you so much, Kenneth. Welcome you here. And I'm really excited to hear the story, what you have to tell us. Please tell us a bit more about your background, a bit more about the book, and all over how you became the laundry man.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you for welcoming me to the program. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Kenneth Rijok. I am a financial crime consultant, which means my job is to help you make sure that you don't get stuck taking dirty money. I will tell you a little bit about what I do, and of course, some details about my book, The Laundry Man. And then we'll go on to talk about banking and payments, because I have experience in both. I spent my young life as a bank lawyer at the only Miami law firm that had a branch in London and in New York. And of course, I was stuck in the banking department. But let me go back to the beginning and start the story for you. I'm a Russian American. My family came to the U.S. a century ago, and most of the people in my family are all lawyers as well. After serving in Vietnam, I went to work at a large Miami law firm, and of course, I was placed in the banking law department because of my background in law school. And I spent several years representing international banks, local banks, credit unions, and non-bank financial institutions, which of course runs the gamut of anybody from a payments business to a business which is dealing with money services. Okay. There came a time in my life when I was getting a divorce, and in the course of that, I happened to hook up with a number of people who were also Vietnam veterans like myself. And remember, this is a period in which America was frankly in love with drugs, and many of the people that I found myself becoming friends with all were people who had my Vietnam experience, but at the same time, they were quite disillusioned. Understand that it was America's then longest war, 15 years. And yeah, of course, it didn't end happily for most people. To make a long story short, I started out as a civil lawyer with my own office after leaving a large firm, but I happened to be in touch with a number of people who were all involved in what I considered at that time to be a victimless crime, and that was smuggling marijuana. Now, you wonder how I get involved with something like that? Well, you might call me the accidental money launderer, because in the process of getting a divorce, I moved in with two young ladies, and of course, I'm a new bachelor. One of them is involved in a motorcycle accident and has a broken leg. So she goes to stay with a friend, and I go over to meet this gentleman. And it's like I'm looking at myself. It's somebody who's my exact age, also served in Vietnam, and he's a teacher of Spanish. But of course, remember, I live in a town where the majority of the people are foreign born and are bilingual. He is from Middle America, so how is he a Spanish teacher? Well, it turns out that when he was a child, his father, who was a missionary, was posted to Cuba, and he grew up in eastern Cuba in Oriente province. But of course, he became not only bilingual, but bicultural. After the Cuban Revolution and he moves back to the United States, he is much more comfortable living in the Hispanic world than he is in the Anglo world. He becomes a teacher of Spanish, but because of his background, he mixes and mingles with people from all of the 30 countries of Latin America. Well, I really like this guy because we are, fellow bachelors, having a great time in our early 30s. And when the time is right, he invites me to move in with him and become his roommate. He owns a house, but of course he lives alone. Well, I moved in and everything was good for about 2 days, when all of a sudden one night, I hear all sorts of noise from the living room, and I go out there to check it out. And I find out that a bunch of businessmen from California have all come in carrying huge, what we lawyers call trial briefcases. I saw that to be strange because he's a Spanish teacher, a part-time Spanish teacher, I might add. But I go back to bed, and then a few minutes later, I hear a knock at the back door. So then I'm up. Then I see a number of Colombians come in the back door with what we call satchels. And what have I got myself into? Well, I happen to be living in a house where the person who owns it happens to be a broker of illicit substances. He was the actual liaison between Colombians and South Americans who were smuggling and importing drugs, and Americans and Canadians who were wholesaling and buying it from them. Well, it turns out I lived in that house for 6 months, and I got what you and I might call a master's degree in money laundering and in financial crime and in cocaine trafficking. Why? Because I was exposed to the entire gamut of people in that illegal line of work. The wholesalers, the transporters, the shippers, the professionals on the fringes of any illegal activity, the bankers, the accountants, everybody. So what did I do? Well, after 6 months of actually soaking up all that knowledge and realizing how dangerous it was where I lived, I moved out and went back to the practice of law. I had actually pretty much taken time off after my divorce, and, It might have been a period in which I could have found something else more constructive to do, but remember, sometimes people make bad choices. So I'm back at my office practicing law, and all these people that I met during the 6 months I lived in this gentleman's house are all coming to my office because my job is to take care of clients. They want to do a number of things. For example, I'm selling my house. I'm buying a business. I need to form a corporation. I'm selling my boat. I'm buying an airplane. Now that's pretty much what people do in ordinary civil practice. But remember this, these people were all involved in drug trafficking. All of these things I was doing were used to facilitate what they were doing. So for me, it's more or less, don't ask, don't tell. And one day, somebody comes in the office with a request of something that I ordinarily would not do. They said, listen, I just made $6 million smuggling in marijuana, and what I need is, I need somebody to launder this. Well, of course, I had a vague idea about what money laundering was because I was a bank lawyer. But on the other hand, the actual nuts and bolts, the techniques, what we call tradecraft, I had never engaged in. Why? Because it was a 20-year federal felony. So, unfortunately, I took that fork in the road, and whereas I didn't know how to do it, I thought I'd better learn how to do it because I had already said I would. Now, I told you I have 5 lawyers in my family. And you can always choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. And one lawyer in particular had just gotten out of prison because he had laundered and moved $9 million, which his clients had stolen from the Cuban government. So who do I go to? I go to Cousin Peter. And what am I asking him? How do I launder $6 million? He says, how about you go down to the Caribbean? I'll introduce you to some lawyers and bankers down there. You can open up some bearer share accounts where nobody knows who owns the company. You can move the money into offshore banks, and you can launder it through that. Well, I considered that, and then I followed his instructions. I went out and engaged a Learjet company, pushed my clients into suits and, of course, business garb, and loaded them and $6 million on a Learjet in Fort Lauderdale, with instructions for the pilot to take us down to a Caribbean tax haven island. I can tell you that was the beginning of how I moved hundreds of millions of dollars and of a 10-year career in which I was on duty 24/7. And frankly, I didn't sleep very much. So I loaded all the clients up. They're all dressed up. They're thinking and claiming that we're going to Puerto Rico for a business meeting. But in truth and in fact, we're going to a tiny little British island called Anguilla, from the French word for eel, which lies in the Eastern Caribbean and which is part of a small network of offshore financial company jurisdictions. So we fly out of Fort Lauderdale, and a couple hours later, we're ready to land in Anguilla. But of course, it's a very primitive airfield. They don't take jets ordinarily, and they don't have the facilities. And of course, we're almost out of fuel. So what do? I follow the instructions that I received from my cousin, and he says, go to St. Martin. You can land there. Nobody will inspect the plane. Nobody, of course, will in any way, shape, or form interfere with what you're doing. Well, I had my doubts, but when I got there, I realized that the half French and half Dutch island of Saint Martin, or Sint Maarten if you're Dutch, is divided in the middle because half of it belongs to one European power and the other half to another. And 400 years ago, when they split up the island, they decided, let's eliminate immigration and customs. Why? Because we don't want people to have to go through immigration to go from one side of the island to the other. So here we are, we land in St. Martin on the Dutch side. Somebody comes on board and sells us fuel. But of course, nobody's inspecting what we have on board. Yes, we have $6 million. But what if we had the plans for the cruise missile? What if we had a vial with the bubonic plague? What if we were moving arms or ammunition? Then again, it's a duty-free port. Okay, so we're loaded up and then we go across 3 nautical miles from St. Martin to Anguilla. Anguilla happens to be a tiny little country with some very religious people. There are 60 churches there, all built by the people who live there, and only a few thousand population. And of course, at that point, it had about 10 banks and another 290 as virtual banks located within the 10. So we fly into Anguilla, and of course, in any other country, they would have inspected our bags and arrested us. Why? We're carrying all this cash. But in Anguilla, what we are doing is we have created a middle class in the offshore business center. What does that mean? That means that all those people who used to be fishermen or who had to work in a hotel or go to Puerto Rico to get a job are now bank clerks, couriers, people who work in offshore financial centers. We actually helped create a middle class in a country which basically was nothing more than a tourist destination. So we then walk out into the sunlight. We've been allowed to enter, and there's our lawyer waiting for us. But he's not just any lawyer. He happens to be on a nearby island of St. Kitts, the foreign minister, the UN ambassador, and the ambassador to the United States. In other words, who's our lawyer? He's the local version of Henry Kissinger. He's so powerful, he can never be arrested in the United States, and he's one of the people who is my direct contact for money laundering. Well, we go into an offshore bank, and they run all the money through counterfeit detectors and money counters because there are always a couple counterfeits, and they charge 0.5% just to count the money. Where does all the money go? It goes into what we call bearer share accounts. The corporations that own those accounts issue their stock to bearer, just as if you took a currency note and passed it across the table to your friend. Whoever owns that share certificate payable to bearer owns the corporation and thereby owns the bank accounts. There's no paper trail as to who the owners are. So all of this money goes into these offshore accounts, and it's all earning 5-figure interest rates. A few minutes later, our work is done. We leave the bank, and then an hour or two later, a courier jet arrives from New York, picking up all that money and sending it into the bank's correspondent accounts in the United States. Why? Because the offshore bank has no need for the money. But of course, American banks can then lend that money out at a much higher rate of interest. So our clients are getting 10% on the money. The money was lent out to a Fortune 500 company that night at 15%. So who's making a lot of money here? The clients who are involved in crime, the onshore bank, the offshore bank, everybody but the tax man. That was the beginning of a 10-year expedition of taking trips overseas, moving money into the tax havens, and laundering. Now, how did I launder that cash? Well, in the very beginning, it was all this very primitive method of what we call bulk cash smuggling. That's where you, number one, move the money into an offshore financial center. As we know, that is called placement. What we're doing is we're evading any kind of American or continental reporting requirement. Where's the money going from there? Well, in many cases, the money went to another tax haven. Why is that? Remember your law. Placement, the second phase of money laundering, is where you take your money in an offshore bank and move it to another offshore jurisdiction. Why is that? Well, what you want to do is you want to basically try to ensure that any law enforcement agency that's investigating you or your clients has lost the paper trail at that point. The money in this case was moved from Anguilla to Panama. Where did it go from there? Well, it went all the way around the globe to Asia. In this case, it went to Taiwan. Why? Because the United States doesn't have any kind of diplomatic relationship with Taiwan, and it was a safe place to move the money. From there, the money goes all the way back around the world to the UK, to London, to what we call the local financial center or the city. It went into corporate accounts there. Still layering. Now, what about integration, the last phase? Some of those clients wanted to buy a shopping center in Canada. To do that, they had a lawyer form a corporation there and then borrow the money from what appeared to be a bank in London, but in truth and in fact, it was our own controlled corporation with a name that was deceptively similar to that of a major European bank. In other words, they're borrowing the money from themselves, getting a tax break, and then, of course, the money is becoming integrated into the legal system. Eventually, they sell the shopping center. Having cleaned the money, they can then invest it in any kind of other enterprise anywhere in the globe. That's how I first started getting involved in money laundering. Now, remember, bulk cash smuggling is a very primitive method. It's one in which most money launderers don't engage in. They want to do more sophisticated, more advanced methods because, number one, they know that you're only limited by your imagination in the world of money laundering. You should understand that money launderers get up nights and weekends just for the purposes of creating new techniques in which to deceive bankers, people in non-bank financial institutions, and any other type of financial enterprise where payments need to be made. Now, many years go by. I'm still a bank lawyer. Everybody thinks I'm a legitimate person. However, every Thursday night, I get on a plane. I fly offshore to the tax havens. And once a month, I spend a week in Europe laundering money. There comes a time when one of my clients' organizations makes over $200 million. So they decide to retire. But like in all businesses, they then sell their business to another person in their group. And that individual makes a few mistakes, and the whole thing starts to be rolled up by law enforcement. And one day, I'm sitting in my law office preparing for a commercial closing because the whole world knows, believes, and thinks that I'm just a regular, boring civil lawyer. When the Internal Revenue Service comes in and arrests me, charges me with what we call racketeering, which is basically the business of being a career and professional criminal. And of course, I was guilty. At that point, I realized that if I was to go to trial, I'd probably go to jail between 20 years to the rest of my life. I decided to own up. I decided to plead guilty. And at the end of the day, I was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in prison, where I troop off to go with a bunch of other people in one of those prisons that deals with white-collar criminals. About 6 months after I get to prison, the government comes to me and says, listen, we tried to catch you for years and years. We caught you because your clients, frankly, informed on you and gave you up. You started out in life as a Vietnam soldier. You were a responsible bank lawyer. You made a lot of mistakes. You need to basically turn the corner and go back to a legitimate life. So I was offered an opportunity to give testimony against a number of clients who had put me there in the first place. I was involved in the first ever American-Swiss money laundering investigation, where the U.S. government and the Swiss government basically seized millions of dollars of my clients' money, and my sentence was reduced to only 2 years, and I was released from prison. And that was 30 years ago. So I've lost my license to practice law. None of my bank clients will talk to me. The lawyers in town won't talk to me. And instead of making tens of thousands of dollars a week, I'm making $500 a week as a legal researcher. But then fate lends me a hand. 6 months later, law enforcement is back to talk to me. Why? Because they know that I have a decade of experience on the dark side. They know that I've been all around the Caribbean. They know I've worked in dozens of tax havens, and they know I have contacts. What they want me to do is to teach people in law enforcement how to catch people like me. Well, one day I got on a plane. I flew to Daytona Beach, Florida, and I sat down in front of 500 law enforcement people. What did they want? They wanted to know, could I teach them to catch people like me? Of course, I was part of I guess if it looks to kill, I wouldn't even be here today, because they knew I was a convicted money launderer, and they knew that I had done a lot of bad things. I had facilitated my clients' drug profits into legitimate investments all around the world. But at the end of the day, when I had taught them how to catch money launderers, I had discovered my niche. Why don't I use that information that I learned on the dark side to help people? So I spent a decade after that flying around North America, teaching people in law enforcement and in government how to catch money launderers in the act in real time. And then I was asked to testify before the United States Congress 3 times in favor of strict litigation and legislation about money laundering. Why? Because from my experience, I knew what laws would be effective. Then 9/11 happens. And of course, we have the USA Patriot Act, which changed the whole world. We're now in the global war and fight against terrorism. And all those people who didn't want to talk to me in the past, in the private sector and the banking world, all came to me and said, Ken, teach me how to catch a money launderer when I'm working in my bank. So what did I do? Well, I went to work in a big company, which had $1 billion portfolio of investments. And my job was to take 6- and 7-figure investors and determine if they were suitable for investing in the company, because they were from around the world in a lot of high-risk places. And I can tell you that I had more fun catching money launderers than I had being one. I worked on that job until I went to work for WorldCheck, which, as you might know, is a company which offers a database for high-risk individuals and entities. And I spent the next 5 years traveling around the world to more than 100 countries, teaching people in the private sector how to spot money laundering techniques, how to interdict them, how to stop them in real time, and how to make sure that you can keep financial crime out of your bank or out of your financial institution. I can tell you that it's been a very interesting trip. It's been a very interesting ride in that I decided at that point to write my autobiography, The Laundryman. So my job, what I do now, is I try to explain what we call tradecraft, the details. Well, if you're in the banking world or you're in the payment sector, what should you be looking for? What are the issues? What are the problems? What are the techniques? What are the tricks of the trade that money launderers use to move the money through your bank or move payments through your payments processing company with impunity? And that's why we're here.
What a journey. Absolutely amazing journey. And I think it was a good thing that it happened. Of course, it was a bad thing, but eventually you turned all of the misfortune into your benefit, because now you're advising companies how to think like a criminal. And that's how they can easily find out more about money laundering and basically help to catch the so-called bad guys. But what I noticed is that back in the day, when you mentioned all of these stories, is that the cash was a whole different approach as of today. I think the financial institutions and the banks did not really ask about the source of funds. So somewhat it was easier to commit crime. And having worked with the larger banks and the financial institutions today, you see that the regulation is catching up more and more with these criminals, right? So in today's world, how would you say, is it still easy to commit money laundering, or it's just getting harder and harder and it's just easier to do the right thing and just not trying to cheat the system? What do you think?
Plane and fly there. Nowadays, you can form an offshore company anonymously in the privacy of your own office. You can then arrange to have funds sent by an anonymous means, and you can not physically be involved but still manage to get it done. the problem is that while many financial institutions now have AML CFT programs, while they're into transaction monitoring, while they're into client identification, and while people in payments processing have got software and platforms to help them, remember the flip side, that people involved in money laundering are just as sharp as they are, if not sharper. If they are lawyers with banking experience, or if they're accountants who know how to hide things, and they have not just the technical background, the training, the education, and the experience, but they have the modern use of software to assist them, it's become a very uneven battle. Because remember this, bankers are clock punchers. I hate to say this. They do their work, they review their files, and they go home at the end of the day. Well, the money launderers are obsessed, because if they make a mistake and they lose a lot of money, it could be their life. Remember, money laundering might be a white-collar crime, but remember who the clients are. They're drug traffickers. There are people involved in arms trafficking. They're international sanctions evaders. They are human slave traffickers. They're all sorts of people that you would not want to meet on a dark street. So these money launderers, they stay up nights and weekends just to contrive new methods, just so that they can beat the banks and beat the payment processors and then move on to a new technique, which is why one of the things we want to cover in the future, of course, is what are the actual advanced techniques that people use to launder money through banks and through payment processors, which we'll cover, of course, in the next seminar. It's important that these techniques, these methods, what we call tradecraft, become secondhand to the people in the banking world and the payments world. So when they see it, when they spot it, they can catch it and they can stop it. Because we live in a very advanced society where things move at a fast pace. But the people on the other side of the equation, Victoria, they're just as sharp as the sharpest people in the compliance office.
I think you need to think like a criminal to be able to see their next steps, right? And it requires a very specific way of thinking, and in the same way that you need to think like a bank in order to understand what is their requirement. So it entails to see things from a different perspective. And as you said, the motivation is obviously higher for the criminals than for the banks, because when you're working for a bank, it's just a job. But when, as you said, when you're a criminal, it becomes a lifestyle. So you mentioned that there are still a lot of vulnerabilities in the banking system, and it's even easier today to do money laundering than back in the day. So you think that there are certain patterns that we can filter out? Are there any very classic scams? And if yes, will you be teaching us that in the seminar that we will have with you?
Yes, ma'am. You need to understand that there's a special perspective that money launderers have, and it is that the mission is number one, which means that they will create techniques, which we will cover in the seminar, which are probably totally outside the knowledge of the average banker or the average payments processor, because they wouldn't even think in a moment that a certain legitimate industry or business could be used and employed for the purposes of cleaning dirty money. What we're going to talk about in the seminar is the actual methods that money launderers use. Let's take, for example, in the payments sector, payments processors. You know, they are basically so focused on looking at things like fraud and simple white-collar crime, because that's what they think they're going to find. But they have no clue as to what sophisticated money launderers are doing to move dirty money and clean it through payments processing. Remember that the number of individuals involved in money laundering successfully cannot be counted, because they're a hidden group of people. But they are, statistically 95% effective in doing their dirty deeds. What we're going to cover in the seminar is the methods that money launderers use to actually create companies or take over companies that exist so that they can then move their dirty money through what everybody in the payments company thinks is legitimate trade, clean that cash, actually pay taxes on it, and thereby totally evade any anti-money laundering that the payments processors would even dream about employing. Because it looks so clean, they have no clue that it started out as cocaine profits.
It's really hard to trace back. And one thing really hit my ear when you mentioned the origin of your journey, that they charge you 0.5% just to count the money. So I assume money laundering is a very expensive thing to do, but does it still worth it? Is it not just easier to do everything legally? Because if you have to pay, obviously, for hiding the identity and to the bank and to create the documents and figure out new ways, and then you pay the tax. It seems like, does it even worth it? Does crime still pay?
Well, that's a good point, Victoria. The thing is that, remember, the one thing that I learned when I was sitting in a law office in a tax haven jurisdiction, and I looked on the wall and I saw all the companies that he had formed for people who were involved in that business, the money launderers were only part of the issue. There's a whole other group of individuals who, for one reason or another, need to launder their profits or their proceeds. Remember, there's all sorts of other illegal activities going on in the world, and those individuals, the last thing they want to do is to get caught in the act. In the developing world, of course, corruption is king, and people who are taking bribes and kickbacks illegally to allow businesses to operate, to get government contracts, the last thing they want is to have to be exposed. Then we have politically exposed persons, individuals who work in government, who have access to government money, who frankly steal it and throw it into a tax haven bank to hide it from the legitimate law enforcement in their country. There are also people that are engaged in all sorts of other despicable activities. And they, of course, the last thing they want to do is spend the rest of their life in prison. So it's not just the traditional money laundering of drugs or guns. It's also people in all sorts of other illegal activities who know that if that ever surfaces, they may never see their freedom again for the rest of their lives. So people who are tax cheats, very wealthy people who don't want to give even a portion of their money to their government, who may be charging too much for taxes anyway, and who use the money laundering system for the purposes of hiding their profits or their assets so that they don't have to pay the tax man. So by and large, most of the people, when you ask them, don't you think you should just follow the law and pay your taxes and do it right? Their attitude is such that, no, I have too much to lose.
Once you're too deep, I guess it's more costly to get out of that. You think that now, because everything is interconnected, we are talking about international payments and international regulations and global banking world and the global financial system. Now we see that the currencies more or less disappear, and we've got the majority of the currencies in dollars where the trade takes place. So it looks like that the world just becomes smaller and smaller by trading with each other and make it available for everyone. And do you still see that there are specific countries where money laundering is easier? Is there still any financial hubs which we need to pay attention, and we need to see that if the money is coming from or related to that certain jurisdiction or country, that is a higher likability of having money laundering? Or you think that now, regardless where the activity is taking place, we have to see that maybe it is subject to money laundering? So what do you think? Now, in a harmonized regulatory environment, do we still have high-risk countries and more likely money laundering activities based on that country where the money is coming from?
Well, unfortunately, it's probably worse now than it was 30 years ago, because back then we had the drug producing and drug transit countries. Now we have situations where sophisticated criminals are able to use even the most advanced Western jurisdictions, finding a way in through their problems, even though they have strict regulations, finding a way in which to successfully move money in plain sight, whether it's trade-based money laundering, whether it's the use of sophisticated and advanced techniques, whether it's the use of obscure techniques that nobody could even understand, let alone identify and interdict. So even in the most advanced and highly regulated democratic nations, the ability of these innovative money launderers to find a crack and exploit it remains basically that they can work with impunity. So there is no such thing anymore, because of modern technology, as a low-risk jurisdiction, because the fact that it's low risk will, of course, attract financial criminals for the purposes of hiding money right in plain sight. So the bottom line is that I wish that it was true that excess regulation drives financial crime out, but unfortunately, it's ineffective against a determined opponent.
Wow. And do you think that we have accidental money laundering as well, or it always have to be intentional? Is there any excuse when someone just, let's say, forgets to pay the taxes, or is not really intentionally getting involved in criminal activities, or they just don't know it better that certain activities or money flows are illegal? Do you think that there is a difference between money laundering and money laundering based on what was the original intent and purpose of that transaction? Or you think as long as it's just breaking the law, doesn't matter if people knew about it and willingly committed crime, they should be punished in the same way, and that money laundering is basically money laundering no matter where it came from?
Well, the problem is that, we live in a highly regulatory world. And unless you have professional advice, unless you have a knowledgeable compliance officer in your company, you might end up unwittingly violating a number of regulations, or worse, of criminal law while you're haphazardly operating your business. You might end up with a huge fine from one country, but you could be charged in another one. So we live in a world where if you don't have proper legal advice by a competent lawyer and an experienced compliance department, as well as outside advice, you're right. You stand a risk of being charged with all sorts of violations, some of which could, frankly, put you in prison because maybe you did something that you tried to cut a corner, or you tried to evade a tax, and somehow you end up in the hot seat. You're right. There are problems, and anybody in the business world has to have competent advice if they expect to not just make a profit, but survive.
Interesting. Let's talk a bit about blockchain and crypto. And of course, are we going to touch them in the upcoming masterclass and seminar that you're going to host for us? Because what I have noticed quite recently, that as soon as money laundering comes into the picture, everybody assumes that crypto is being anonymous. It's very easy to send money between different people, different companies. The tax office doesn't have the particular ways to figure out if it's coming from legit or illegal sources. So it's an easy to use tool if someone wants to commit money laundering. Are we going to talk about crypto? How much are we going to talk about crypto? And do you think really crypto is the go-to vehicle when we want to commit money laundering nowadays?
Well, you know that fortunately or unfortunately, we are dealing with cryptocurrency, whether we want to take it or not. Even if you're not interested in being involved personally, it becomes part of our economy. But remember this, that in many ways it was created for the purposes of doing an end run around the banking system. And it has a much higher propensity for good as well as evil. And many of the countries underregulate it, block it, ban it, find a way in which to try to control it. And anybody involved in the world of crypto, even indirectly, has created a much higher risk scenario for their own business or company. So yes, we're going to talk about cryptocurrency. We're going to talk about the pitfalls. We'll talk about the uses and, unfortunately, the abuses, which have had a very high amount of publicity and which have scared a lot of people. The protections we need to discuss. We need to discuss the ways to identify the problems. And more importantly, we need to find a way in which that, the banking and payments world can live with crypto and not get burned in the process.
It is a very complex topic, as I can see. Tell us a bit more about are we going to discuss? What else are you going to teach us? A bit more insights of what we can learn from you during these couple of hours of the content that you will provide to us.
Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to actually take the listener and the viewer inside the way that money launderers operate these companies. You're going to learn, let's say if you're in the payment sector, you're going to learn how your opponents will put together a program which you have no clue about its illegality, either coming in or going out, how they operate it, how they interface with you, and what protections they build in, which you need to be aware of. What are the red flags? What are the things which drive you immediately to talk to your in-house counsel and your compliance officer or your outside advisor because you see something and you need to say something? We're going to talk about it from the perspective of the practicing money launderer, because I want to put the viewer into the shoes of somebody operating a company which is going to launder money through a commercial bank or through a payments processing firm, and is going to do it successfully using methods and techniques which you may not understand, but you will now know how to spot.
Amazing. I can't wait. I think it's going to be a very, very, very interesting course. And I would like to encourage everyone to definitely check it out on the Soltesz Institute. Ken, is there something that you still want to tell us, but we just haven't talked about it yet? Is there something that you feel strongly about and you want to share before we wrap up?
Well, I also think that if you want to sit in the shoes of a money launderer, you're going to have to understand a little bit about how he or she operates. The point of view from these people, remember, we're all talking about professionals. They have the same education, training, and experiences as you do, because a lot of them started out in law firms or accounting firms or in international banks. But for some reason or another, whether it was money, risk, thrills, or somehow they got brought into a problem where once in you don't get out, they have chosen to be on the dark side. And what we're going to explain in the seminar is you need to understand their perspective, their point of view. What are their strengths and what are their weaknesses? What are the things you need to look for? And what are the things that if you see them, you better say something, because something is going on that you don't understand and somebody needs to decipher it for you. Remember that as a compliance officer, whether you work in an international bank or a payments processing company, you are focused on your own AML issues. You don't always appreciate or identify issues which are outside of your realm, outside of your given designation of work. But remember that when things come around that you don't understand, but at the same time you have a hint that there might be a red flag or a problem, that's the time to raise your hand, because if it's frankly over your head, that's the time you need to get help. So we're going to talk about the red flags of money laundering. At the same time, of course, we're going to talk about these exotic techniques These things which you may only see once in your lifetime, but if you see them, that's half the battle.
Right. So we're going to develop a good gut feeling of people that if something doesn't look right, then most probably it is not right. Well, thank you so much. I think we discussed a lot of interesting topics and I really can't wait to see the whole course. So I'm really looking forward to that. And if anyone has any questions regarding Ken and about money laundering, that I would like to encourage everyone to please reach out to us, reach out to the Soltesz Institute and tell us about the problems and the issues and the questions that you have, because that's the only way that we can create a more ethical and transparent industry. And we can filter out all of those bad guys and catch all of those creative ways of the money launderers. Kenneth, is there something else you would like to add?
Well, I'd like to invite everybody to attend the seminar. I think it would be worthwhile. I think you'll learn things which you can't get out of books. You're going to learn about techniques which you might wonder, how would you ever see that if you didn't understand how they work? Some things are exotic, unusual, even obscure, but money launderers rely upon the fact that you cannot explain what you're seeing, and thereby you want to pass it off as a legitimate transaction. Remember that banks every day are confronted with sophisticated money laundering techniques. Also, payment processors will be, of course, facing a blinding amount of money laundering tricks and techniques that they must identify, and they are the gatekeepers. They need to stop it and nip it in the bud. We're going to talk about how you do that at the seminar, and we invite you to attend.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And looking forward for everyone to join that seminar and learn a lot about money laundering and more. Thank you so much, Ken. Thank you very much who watched us, and looking forward to see everyone at the course.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you everyone for watching.